Okay, good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Monday, October 27th, and there's so much going on out there. It's hard to know where to start. We have potential war with Venezuela. I'm looking at Israel's next move, either going back into Gaza, the West Bank, potentially Iran. There's this trade war with China, escalations in Ukraine, these new oil sanctions. But maybe it's better if we just take a step back and kind of look at it in the big picture. For me, this just feels like any one of these things that I mentioned is just be massive news, but they're all happening at the same time. And there's
Right.
so much stuff here domestically that I'm not even paying attention to because everything else is happening. So it just feels like to me this just has to be the end of the empire. It just seems like there's no other way to look at it. It's definitive in my opinion. What are your thoughts?
Um, I wish I could agree, but no, I don't think it's the end of the empire yet. Um, I guess in a way, say all these things happening everywhere shows that the empire, its tentacles, do reach around the globe, and it hasn't withdrawn yet. I think at least in one instance, I think maybe we could say two, we see very clear evidence that the empire is crumbling. And I think the most obvious is in the economic war with China, where China has actually, not only has it refused to comply, but it's actually kind of taken the U.S. playbook and is now imposing sanctions and restrictions on the U.S. And we're crying foul. We're just horrified. How could you do this? And of course, we had been doing that to them for many years, if not decades.
Has this ever happened where a country's imposed sanctions on the U.S. since, World War II?
I'm sure you could find some sort of obscure instance, but I can't think of anything.
Nothing substantial that actually has
Yeah,
weight.
right. This is a first. Let's say during the Cold War years, the Soviet Union was a military rival above all. It was more or less our equal in military terms, but it really was not an economic rival. It was not part of an important player in the global trading system. China clearly is. China has, passed us in, according to many different economic measures. And we have foolishly, in an effort, well, there was a time, of course, when China was much weaker, not too long ago. And you go back 20 years, much weaker than it is now relative to the U.S., much more dependent on the U.S. And we could get away with, imposing whatever sanctions or restrictions that we wanted to. Back then, we actually didn't impose so many. And it's now, when they have really turned the tables, they have surpassed us in important things that we get Trump and he's starting to do this. And, it was not, he didn't start it, of course, it started before him, but he has accelerated this process of sanctioning China. And they have turned the tables on him. And that's really quite remarkable. That is, if you want to look for a sign of end of empire, I think that's the most obvious one. And then, I think the second most obvious is Russia and the failure of the economic war there, and other things that we've discussed that over the last many months.
Could you go into some more detail how China has turned the tables? Is it mainly the rare earths? Is that the big card that was played? Soybeans as well? I mean,
Yeah. Yeah, that's the one. That's the most important one. That they restricting it. They're demanding a license, and they're also
for
they're
rare
imposing.
earths
Yeah, for
or
rare earths,
soybeans?
right?
Okay.
Exactly, and they're imposing those same requirements on third countries, and that's the kind of thing that the U.S. used to do. And it still has many of those kind of restrictions in place against China. Uh, Another clear instance was okay. The U.S. attempted to. It really was the U.S., but through Netherlands, seize this company, Nexperia in the Netherlands, and the Chinese didn't take it lying down. They told their employees, "You don't have to obey them," and then immediately cut off this company, which is in fact a subsidiary of a Chinese company, from its Chinese supply of chips. Again, there was no there was just an immediate response. Instead of saying, it was okay, you slap me, I'll slap you twice as hard, and that is a huge difference. I have heard. I think I saw this report this morning, and I'm sorry, I should have. I can't recall the source, but that it is reported, or it has been reported, that in the upcoming negotiations between the U.S., I guess they're ongoing. In fact, their trade representatives are meeting now, and then Trump and Xi Jinping are going to meet at the end of this week. But anyway, the Chinese are playing hardball, and they're insisting that the U.S. actually remove all these restrictions that they have imposed over the years. He said, none of these were, because these, they were really efforts to stymie the rise of China. That's what they were. And the Chinese are saying you're going to have to remove all of them. And I think that's really shocking the Americans. They're just not used to this. They're used to, they're used to being the hegemon. Let's just be honest. And the Chinese, more than any other country right now, is telling them, no, you're not the hegemon anymore. So again, if you're looking for the end of the empire, I think you can see it. The first really, again, you could see that in some respect with respect to, when you look at the Russia-Ukraine war. But I think it's even more obvious in this case, this attempted economic war against China.
Do you think that China will be able to get the removal of all tariff sanctions? I mean, because there's an existing 30% on now, right? And they're going to add a different 100%. Yeah. I guess there's all these other things that have been sanctioned in over the years, but will they actually, does China have that much leverage that it can just dictate the terms completely?
I have trouble believing that the U.S. is going to climb all the way down. That would be such a humiliation. I think they're going to try very hard to find some kind of safe-facing compromise. And it's possible that, it's more than possible. I think it's even likely Chinese know that they're not going to get all of this. But they are, that's what you do in negotiations. You present your maximum demand, and then you can relax that somewhat. That's what negotiations are all about. And we'll see just how much they relax it. They just haven't shown much of a willingness to do that. So I imagine that they won't get everything, but they may get a lot of it. That's a possibility.
Yeah, maybe some token. But I mean, what we've seen with Russia and the United States, Russia has stated its position, and it's non-negotiable. It just sticks to its guns. So it is, if it's true that China has all the leverage, then, in theory, why would they, they not stick to their guns? I mean, does the U.S. have, sometimes I think maybe I get into this thinking that the U.S. just doesn't have anything, militarily and economically, but maybe I'm wrong. Do we have some leverage here that we can,
there's
other than our consumer power?
Yeah. Well, no, it's more than just consumer power. It's not, it's not entirely true. It's not true that the Chinese have surpassed us in every area. There are some areas, where our technology is still ahead. It used to be true of like 90%. You go 20 years ago, and I don't know what the percentage is now, but it's well above zero. It's just that there are areas where we do have a clear advantage. I think there was some kind of software that it was recently the Trump administration decided they would deny that to the Chinese. Actually, a lot of these cases, when they have denied certain technologies, we did have the lead in that particular technology. The thing is, the Chinese have shown the ability to say, okay, you've cut us off. Now we need to fall back on our own resources. And then they manage to develop the technology. This has happened more than once. So, there is leverage. There is, again, the Chinese, all things being equal, will just as soon, to be able to have full access to the American market, that is to their benefit. They have made the calculation that they can do without it, and they can. Again, there's we saw that recently in spite of the very sharp drop in exports to the U.S. this year. Overall, exports have gone up. They managed to more than compensate for that drop by selling to other parts of the world, other regions. But still, why not? It is to their advantage. They would like to have access to that market, and there are certain technologies that would at least help them in the short run. So it's not like the U.S. is entirely without, any sort of bargaining power. It does have some, but it does not have hegemonic bargaining power. Nothing close to that.
Right. So these trade talks are going on in Kuala Lumpur. November 1st is the deadline that Trump set for himself. Once again, he sort of paints himself in these corners with this tariff deadline. What do you think is going to happen? What do you think is going to...
I don't think that tariff is going to be imposed. And in fact, I think yesterday that Treasury Secretary Bessent said, that we were not going to need that. It was very helpful that Trump imposed that. That gave us some bargaining power. And but now we've moved beyond that. So he's pretty much saying that, that tariff is not going to be imposed.
Okay, so do you expect some big announcement that there will be a conclusion in sense of this round of trade war and when we get to this deadline, or do you think it's going to be ongoing? Because we saw this happen before. Trump threatened these tariffs, then China says no, back down, the U.S. backs down, we have to concede something, and then we spin it off as some great victory. Do you expect the exact same thing to happen?
I think we're going to be on this merry-go-round probably for the next 3+ years, as long as Trump is in power. We've seen it, of course, in the case of U.S.-Russian relations. It just said, back after Alaska, supposedly an understanding was achieved. Trump came out of it and said, okay, the ceasefire, that doesn't work. We have to have a general peace agreement that addresses root causes. And he actually stuck to that. But I remember back then just thinking, and I'm pretty sure I said, that's Trump, though. It's not going to be a permanent understanding. And then sure enough, 2 months later, he's talking about ceasefire again. And we've seen it in the case of China. Okay, the Chinese will think that they have achieved some kind of understanding, or a trade agreement, but then he'll, and some sort of fit of petulance, some months down the road, he'll announce new tariffs on China. Now, one thing that might tie his hands, I think, is just we're supposed to very shortly, I don't know exactly what the date, it was supposed to be sometime this month, so it should be by the end of this month. The Supreme Court is supposed to rule on his authority to impose tariffs because, of course, that was challenged. That was something the Constitution explicitly grants that power to the Congress and not to the president. And but he's been wielding this. Now he says it's on national security grounds, and I think that's silly, but we'll see. Now, if that is struck down, that could tie his hands, and I think that the markets around the world will breathe a huge sigh of relief. Now, my understanding, if it's struck down, it could really hurt the administration because they would then be liable for these tariffs that were improperly imposed. He actually has collected a fair amount of money. You have to admit this, and some of that is going to, I think, possibly
from the American consumer, though, is what I'm seeing. It's like 90% of it is borne by us.
Right. Well, that's true. That's one thing that people have to understand is when we're talking about tariffs, that's a tax on Americans. It's actually on the importer who passes most of the cost on to, which is an American company, and passes that on to American consumers. But the government, of course, has done well, has collected, I think, a couple $100 billion in tariffs. That's significant. Still nowhere close to having any, significant impact on the budget deficit, but it still is a large number.
Right. But the debt is still going up at a very fast rate. So, it doesn't make any sense. But I mean, you said that China, we might be on this merry-go-round with China. We do a round of this tariff war again and again. But every time that we go around on this merry-go-round, America grows weaker, right? That should be apparent to the rest of the world, and the countries that's engaged in these hostile actions, whether it be Russia or China or Brazil or whatever, they grow stronger and more confident. So you can only go around the merry-go-round so many times, right? Before reality is so apparent to both sides and to the whole world, right?
Yeah, I think that is consequence of this merry-go-round, which is what we also call the Trump administration. Now, in some cases, like Venezuela, maybe it won't be a merry-go-round. Venezuela is much weaker vis-a-vis the U.S. than either Russia or China. And they could, I hope this is not true, but this military operation that seems to be imminent against Venezuela could be successful. Again, I don't want that to be true, but it could. So it could be one case where, okay, yeah, it's not just a merry-go-round. Actually, he went out there and thumped his chest and then actually made good on his threats. And again, the U.S. is a hegemon relative to lesser powers, poor Latin American countries and other poorer countries around the world. Another country that collapsed, not so much, in good part because of the U.S. pressure, of course, was Syria. Syria ended up a very poor country thanks to the sanctions that we imposed on them and our seizure of their wheat fields and oil wells. And you have to say, in the end, it succeeded. Sadly, it succeeded. Again, Turkey, of course, played a very large role in that, and Israel a smaller role. So there can be wins, but there will be wins against lesser powers.
Do you think it's likely that the U.S. could have a so-called win in Venezuela?
I don't know that it's likely. I don't really know a whole lot about Venezuela. I have discussions with Garland Nixon, who's actually been there and spent a lot of time there, and based on what he saw there, he feels that it would be a huge mistake for the U.S. to go in there. That the Venezuelan people are well armed and support the great majority of people support the government and would fight the Americans tooth and nail. So again, we're talking about any sort of ground forces, and I think he must be right about that. Again, it's the terrain there is very much to the advantage of the defender, the local defender. It's jungle and it's hilly, and it would be a nightmare for any sort of ground force. But I'm sure they're going to try to do it all from the air. I don't know that they can. We'll see. And then what if they attempt it from the air? It fails. Then do they try to go into the ground? If they do, then it could. Again, it could be a terrible entanglement, worse than that, it would be a quagmire for the U.S.
Right. I listened to that conversation you had with Garland Nixon, and I think he mentioned that there are been like air defense systems supplied or certain weapon systems from China and Russia, right, in Venezuela. So we don't even fully know what Venezuela is capable of. If they have the ability to shoot down a plane or sink a ship.
Right. I don't know, but apparently they've had a military relationship, especially with Russia, and Russia has supplied with them with S-300s and I guess it's what Su-30 or I can't remember the fighter aircraft. They do have something which is it's not the most advanced by any stretch of the imagination, but it is still a formidable aircraft that's capable of launching missiles that could do real damage to ships. This is what I've heard, and I don't know. I'm getting the second and third hand. I really don't. It's not a question that I've followed very closely, but there could be surprises, right? There could be that one missile that gets through and sinks a ship, and that would be, a huge embarrassment, humiliation for the U.S. And that might lead the U.S. to do the foolish thing and then to try to invade on the ground. There are things that could go wrong. And obviously, there are many things that could go wrong, even if they try to keep it solely, an air war. They might not be able to do that, to pull that off.
Right. Well, you said this attack on Venezuela looks imminent. I feel like we've been saying that for about a month now.
Yeah.
Do you have any idea? Like, would you think that there's a chance that it may not happen at all? Or if it is going to happen, you think it's going to happen quite soon?
I don't think that there's, I think that what they're trying to do, and I've said this before, is that they are trying to just to build up the pressure, by moving all these assets there. Um, they are putting pressure on the Venezuelan government, and they're probably encouraging factions within the government, hoping that maybe some general will attempt a coup, and and lay claim to the bounty, the $50 million bounty that is put on Maduro's head. I think there's something like that's going on. They would prefer to have it done, to have it all happen internally. That would be the cleanest, the prettiest outcome here. But maybe they're finding that's not happening. Nobody's budging. The U.S. has attempted several coups over the years in Venezuela, and they have all failed. And I think, they're probably attempting one right now, or they're trying to lay the groundwork for one. And it's just not working out. They're finding that in spite of what these silly people like Juan Guaido and the recent Nobel Prize winner tells them, actually Venezuelans by and large, there's obviously an important faction, or let's say a minority within the country, that is strongly opposed to the government. But by and large, the great majority they are solidly behind the government, and they will fight for it. And maybe that's what they're finding again, in spite of what the sweet talk, the encouraging talk that they hear from their puppets.
Yeah, well, maybe their puppets are telling them, well, we're ready. You just have to go first, give them a little push, and then we'll come in. And then when it actually happens, who knows if they're actually going to rise up, because from my understanding as well, I listened to some other interview, I forget who it was, but it's on DD Geopolitics, I think. But to say this person was in Venezuela as well, and was just saying that, how everybody is kind of rallying around. And if that's the case, I just feel like a regime change is impossible. The U.S. is not an attractive option for opposition parties anymore. You don't gain the love of the people by saying that you throw your hat in with the U.S., especially thanks to Gaza. So it's just we don't have that regime change power anymore, but it doesn't seem to break through.
Well, we'll find out. I think we might still, again, in places like Latin America, but I agree that the attractiveness, again, we're talking now about the soft power pillar that has been severely damaged, largely because of Gaza, but not just Gaza. And yeah, that's right. It's just like where it used to be that there were many people in these countries that were very happy to associate themselves with the U.S. And obviously those people still exist, and they tend to be wealthier people, people that with real power. They still exist, but I think their numbers are diminishing. Again, it's just that the U.S. is not what it once was. It's still by far the most powerful country in the Western Hemisphere, but it's not nearly as admired, I think, as it once was, and there's this understanding that its power has limits. They've seen the U.S. fail, like for example in Russia or again in this trade war with China.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, let's move over onto the maybe the military pillar a little bit, because we're seeing that the U.S. does not have the leverage, not have the economic might that it thought it did in this trade war with China. But we're seeing in Russia, I think, with Ukraine, more and more just apparent to me, becoming very apparent that the U.S. is really not the military superpower we thought it was in its weapon systems. We haven't seen them proven very well in Ukraine, and there's all this talk about sending the Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine, and we know these are missiles that were developed in the 80s. I know there's been some iterations, updates, and stuff, but they fly at subsonic speeds. We only don't make very much of them. I was looking, we made in 2023 67 of these, very small production for whatever reason, and while Russia, on the other hand, they showcased the Burevestnik, this unstoppable hypersonic missile that just comes out of space, can hit anywhere in Europe, cannot be stopped. And now they just released another missile. I think it's called the Burevestnik. Is that right? Yeah. Something like that?
Yeah, it's the Burevestnik, I think.
Something like that.
Yeah, an extraordinary. It was something that I remember back in 2018. that Putin actually announced that there were several different new weapon systems, missiles in particular, in development, and they would be appearing, in the following years. And one of them was the Burevestnik that was announced just yesterday. The announcement was concerning a successful test. It flew 14,000 kilometers and was able to conduct, a variety of vertical and horizontal maneuvers. So I say that 14,000, it flew for 15 hours. 14,000 kilometers is actually is maybe the low end of its range. It could easily, apparently, fly 20,000 kilometers. It can go halfway around the globe. So in other words, it can actually hit any point on the globe. Yeah, this was something that he promised back then. And I remember when he promised these new missile systems back in 2018, the announcement was greeted with ridicule in the U.S. Partly, I guess, because they had rather clunky graphics or something to show this is like, because that's something we're really good at. We have generally anyway, very flashy graphics and whatever. And I guess that's the way Americans judge things these days. How flashy are your graphics? And theirs were very clunky. So it was just a big joke. But now, in the meantime, they've come out with two hypersonic missiles, a hypersonic cruise missile, hypersonic ballistic missiles that they have been using in
With
Ukraine.
This Burevestnik is hypersonic?
This is not hypersonic.
Oh, okay,
no.
so
Yeah, but anyway, two hypersonic missiles. We're talking about the Zircon and the Kinzhal, which have been used several times. The Kinzhal in particular, many times in Ukraine, and now this the Burevestnik, which is a nuclear. It has a nuclear engine, and so it's virtually it could stay up there. I don't know how long, but there's almost no real limit on it. It can just be up there forever. And the thing is, it can, because it's a cruise missile and it's very maneuverable, it can take all kinds of evasive actions on the way to its target, and is therefore very, very difficult to shoot down. It can fly just very, very close to the surface, over water or over ground. And it's obviously a major development. It shows something very, very strange, about the West. The West is all talk and is very, very self-confident, very smug. It was as other analysts have pointed out, I think, including Alexander Mercouris, it was the U.S. that broke all these missile treaties that we had with the Soviet Union and then Russia. We broke them, unilaterally. And I think the thinking was, well, we don't need to even respect Russia anymore. Especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union, it's just like we can kick them around. What's the point of having a treaty with them? We'll just, we'll do what we want. But what's happened is that actually it's the Russians that have come up with the new systems, and we haven't. We simply haven't. We haven't made these same breakthroughs, which seems to me quite extraordinary. And there's just a lack of, I guess it's just a product of this extraordinary smugness. Say that, well, we are number one, so why do we need to try? I remember back when I was a kid, maybe these ads still exist, but I don't watch TV anymore or anything. But back when I was a kid, you would often, there was a rental agency called Avis. Hertz was number one, Avis was number two, but Avis would actually highlight the fact they were number two. It says, we're number two, so we try harder. And I think maybe that's part of what's going on, sort of like we're Hertz, we're resting on our laurels, for these past couple of decades. And Russia, and, when it comes to military systems, it saw itself as number two, and they tried harder, and they've come up with these new systems that are now well ahead of what the Americans have.
Do you think there is some reality hitting home within the Trump administration or the Pentagon when they see these types of missile systems? Like when we say we have to offer the Tomahawks, or we can't supply them with the Patriot interceptors because we can't produce any, isn't it becoming apparent to NATO and people that, we miscalculated. We thought that the U.S. MIC was more powerful than what it really was. It seems like it was all smoke and mirrors. we're seeing our adversaries, China and Russia, just roll out very advanced weapons. I heard China now has a radar system that operates from space that basically renders any type of U.S. stealth technology, irrelevant now. No, I'm not exactly sure if that's 100% true, but I have seen a lot of missiles and advanced tech that China's rolling out at a huge scale. And we're seeing just the capability of the Russian MIC in Ukraine. So has it hit home? Are we starting to?
I don't know that it has. I mean, I am sure, I have no doubt that there are analysts, experts, within these military establishments, whether we're talking about the U.S. or NATO and Europe, that do see what's going on and are making reports, but it's not clear that has made it up to the top. We're not seeing any sign of that. Maybe they're discussing these things very nervously behind closed doors, but we don't see any evidence of that. There just still seems to be this supreme smugness at the top.
Yeah, you think that the announcements of these new weapon systems should put a little bit of caution in the United States. I mean, like with this nuclear-powered cruise missile you're talking about, basically when I was looking at it, it just said range unlimited, which I feel like is a bit of an exaggeration, right? But it's nuclear-powered, but yeah. It can go forever. But basically that means you can just have this thing flying around, and usually when you're putting in missile defense systems, you have an idea of where the missile's coming from, so you can orientate your missile defense systems to protect from the area of attack. But with this missile, it could just go around the world and hit you from behind. It could literally go anywhere for as long as it wants and just stay low. So you can't really build a defense system against it unless you cover the entire territory, which is pretty much impossible.
Yeah. One thing that you can say is actually reassuring about this system is that you can do, let's say, if the tensions reach some sort of fever pitch and it looks like a nuclear strike might be imminent. Well, the Russians can actually send up a number of these cruise missiles, but they can have them, let's say, circling the Arctic Ocean or something like that, or doing whatever, going off in different directions, but they don't have to strike because they can be up there for, who knows, maybe for a day or longer. And then when it becomes clear that, okay, the threat is past, they can actually call them back. I mean, that's a possibility. And the problem with the hypersonic missiles, of course, is that you just have a few minutes, especially when you're talking about the intermediate ranges in Europe. And that's one reason that we had that intermediate range treaty, is that it just put everything on a hair trigger. And with hypersonic, that becomes even more of a problem. You have a minute to decide or something. And that's just really a terrifying situation. And the Russians are saying, hey, let's work out some treaties here. And the Americans just haven't responded. And I think the hope is with this announcement, it's just like, okay, you're not listening to anything we say. Maybe you'll pay attention to what we do. If we actually develop these new systems, you'll see it's in your interest actually to come to the table and for us to work out something that'll make the world a safer place. But we have not. Again, the Russians have offered to extend the START treaty. Trump said, "Oh yeah, that seems like a good idea," and again, but he never got back to him. He's still on his merry-go-round.
Right. It's got to be very frustrating for the Russians because I think they're trying to reestablish deterrence because we've had the salami slicing and Putin has been exercising restraint and constantly just sort of working with with Trump and trying to find an off ramp, but it's just clearly not working. We're just seeing these continued escalations. So, do you think that this will establish deterrence in some sense? But I just feel like
not.
Exactly. That's what I think. It's just like, how far can you go? I think maybe since we have been able to fire scalp missiles and attack them, and so into pre-existing, Russian borders, pre-2014 Russia, then I think that has kind of maybe opened things up. Maybe that's something that Putin shouldn't have allowed, because now it's just kind of said, oh, the Russians, you can actually strike into Russia and it's okay. Like, we don't have to worry about him. And I think Putin is trying to reestablish deterrence by demonstrating these weapons. But do you think he can? Or there's no, what would it take?
It's just hard to, the problem is when you have an irrational rival, it becomes a real problem. The U.S. was rational during the Cold War. It doesn't mean that everything they did was right or anything, but they were rational. They understood the risks. They respected the Soviet red lines. I'm just not sure that we are rational and that we are, sober again. And maybe we'll go back to this concept of smugness. There's a lack of fear. We used to have a healthy fear, and we just don't seem to have it. Putin continues to be attacked by a lot of people, both I think within Russia, but also within the, let's say, among the geopolitical dissidents. There are people that are really angry that he hasn't been harsher. And, I actually get it. I think they may be right, at least to. They probably are right, at least to some extent. But, and maybe I'm trying to rationalize Putin's moves, but I can understand them. Like going back, if the failure to establish deterrence, like at the end of last year, you have to remember the situation. It was, there was the end of the Biden administration. He was on his way out. Trump was on his way in. Okay, they started these strikes, and the Russians did make this, one demonstrative response with the Burevestnik. Hey, look, this is what we have, and then didn't do anything. But they had a statement, of course, a very, very forceful statement from Trump back then that he thought it was stupid and that he wasn't going to do this. And so they say, okay, look, Biden has done this. Again, maybe the way that Putin looked at it is that we don't escalate right now. Because escalation, even though it might be generally necessary in order to establish a deterrence, it is risky. It could be that rather than establishing deterrence, there's a counter escalation and then we're in real trouble. So I think it was a rational move at that time. But whatever you do, there is a risk. And it seems like, okay, yeah, it seemed to work for the first several months. The Americans they stopped launching these missiles. Now, it's not entirely clear that they have, but it seems like there have been, the Russian Ministry of Defense hasn't admitted to them. We don't have any direct satellite evidence. But it seems that there were some storm shadow strikes on a chemical plant. It seems like that. We're not sure. And if that happened, then that would be, a return to the Biden strikes on pre-2014 territory with missiles that really have to be programmed, again, by NATO. So they are NATO strikes on Russia. And then we're back to where we were. Now, Putin, and there was all that talk about the tomahawks, and then Putin was very restrained about it. Again, I'll speak on Putin's behalf. I think that he did have a psychological profile that you just don't throw the gauntlet down to Trump. You have to talk to him in person. And so he just did not say anything. But then he made that phone call. And after that, you have to say, at least for now, we're on a merry-go-round, but at least for now, the tomahawks are off. So I think he did get through to him that way. And I think, if you can do it that way rather than, I don't know, striking a base in Romania or whatever, that's good. I mean, that may be necessary at some point for the Russians to do that, but if they can avoid it, that's good. So I am going to, stand in Putin's corner on this. And now, though, with the sudden reversal about the summit talks the sanctions, the sanctions, they were very hostile, and then also the Trump's reversal on the understanding. Now he's pushing for a ceasefire. All that happened, and clearly Putin has had enough of it. So he did actually, whereas before he wouldn't say it, this time he said there will be an overwhelming, very serious, if not overwhelming response, is what he said. So he's getting back to it. So, we're back to that very dangerous situation, where I think Trump or Putin does understand the need for deterrence. He saw some ways, that maybe he could work through diplomacy. And I think it's right. Again, maybe I'm just a softie like Putin when it comes to this, and I don't understand the hard realities. I do get the arguments that the other people say. But anyway, I think that, that Putin wasn't wrong to try to explore these possibilities, but he is, he's a very smart man, and he's surrounded by people who are pointing out the perfidy and the unreliability of their partners in America. And he seems to have, accepted their position. So, his most recent statements have actually been quite harsh. And so we may see some, if there is another strike, I don't know, neither side is talking about that chemical plant. And maybe what happened is it did occur, and the Russians said, hey, secretly, this is something that Biden was doing. And remember, what we said about this is a red line for us. We'll just pretend this one didn't happen. But if it happens again, we're going to have to respond. We'll see.
Yeah, I think the problem with being polite with Trump is that Trump just assumes that we're friends, and then he's able to just shape it in his own mind, like, oh, then now it's all good and we can end the war. And it doesn't happen. And then he gets pissed. He even had that comment, I think, after, I don't know, it was the Alaska summit, just like, yeah, we had a good talk, but then he just started shooting missiles into Ukraine. Like, he doesn't understand what's happening, like the Ukraine war. And then he gets upset, I think. So that's a problem if you're being friendly, and then Putin finally lays down the line. Then I think Trump sometimes feels jilted or attacked in some way, in a strange way. And actually, I have a video here that I want to show. This is from maybe 3 or 4 days ago, but I think it kind of just shows the current mood that Trump has towards Putin and Russia.
Thank you. President Putin basically said today that Russia is immune from U.S. sanctions. He said that it would not impact the Russian economy in any serious way. Is he
good.
wrong?
I'm glad he feels that way. That's good. I'll let you know about it in 6 months from now. Okay, let's see how it all works out.
Just talk about that supreme confidence, just like, and you can see, like, I feel like he's taking it personally. Like, oh, you don't think I have the power? Yeah. I'll show you. And I feel like that's kind of how he operates.
Right.
I remember something. I've heard it on Joe Rogan before a while ago, is when he always talks about when Obama was talking to Trump at some White House dinner and said, one thing he said to Trump, well, one thing about you, Mr. Trump, is that, at least I'll be president and you won't be. Something like that. Said that you'll never be president. And then Trump kind of took that, I think, personally. At least that's the way Joe Rogan tells the story.
Oh, okay.
And then and who knows? Some people operate like that, and I can just see Trump being that kind of guy. Yeah. And now he puts in his mind, like, oh, you don't think I can? I'll do it.
Right.
But can he when we talk about these sanctions?
Right. Well, that's exactly what I was talking about, the psychological profile, and why Putin was trying not to just lay down the gauntlet and say, hey, if you do the tomahawks, we're going to do this. And the reaction from Trump, especially when he's publicly challenged, is, well, then I got to send the tomahawks because I can't back down. It's like, who's somebody else to tell me what I can and cannot do? That seems to always be his reaction. Now, he's found, like, especially in the case with the Chinese, that he has had to back down. I think it's just people have come to him and said, look, if we don't if we don't reduce these tariffs, there's going to be riots in the streets. And he kind of understood that. But he won't publicly acknowledge it. He still, has this supreme confidence. And that's something that he wants to maintain so that he gets, he'll threaten sanctions again and again. We'll see. But yeah, in this case, we're talking about the sanctions that he imposed on Russia, and it has to be said that at least in the short run, they are having an effect. Again, we saw that spike in global oil prices. The oil traders responded by bumping up the price of oil by 5%, and there are reports coming out that certain refineries in India have actually stopped or greatly reduced their purchase of Russian oil and are turning to Middle Eastern oil. Now, I don't know what the extent of that is, and what the duration of that will be either. It may be that they just need to make new financial arrangements or something, and then in a month's time, 2 months' time, who knows, they're going to be back to purchasing Russian oil. There was a reason they were purchasing it, because it was a better deal. It's better for India. Now, if they're forced to, for a long period of time, to avoid Russian oil and to purchase, Middle Eastern and even U.S. Produced oil, that's going to have a huge impact on the price of oil around the world, and it's going to actually come back, and it's going to bite the U.S. in the butt there, or it's another case of shooting ourselves in the foot, because But I don't think it's going to last all that long. I think probably there will be other arrangements, but even if it does, let's say just like the worst case scenario and India stops buying oil. Well, one thing that will happen, of course, is the price of oil will go up. It doesn't mean that that's going to compensate entirely for the loss of revenue. But the higher oil prices means that whatever the Russia sells, they get a better profit on it. And so that's one thing that's going to happen. But it will have an effect on let's say again, if India completely stops buying oil, it will have an effect on the Russian economy. It will have an effect on the budget. But it's clear to me again that the Russians are prepared to deal with that. I mean, that they have reserves of strength. They're fighting this war really with one hand tied behind their back. They haven't mobilized the society. If it comes to it where they really are threatened, they will do what it takes. They have many, many more resources to draw from. They haven't gone anywhere close to actually, going into a full war mode or a war economy, in spite of what you hear from the Western press. The economy is not on a war footing. If they need to do that and ration, they will. And they will, they'll fight this war to the end. But I don't think we're going to ever get there. Right. So anyway, it's just like, even if, okay, this really does hurt them, it doesn't stop them. It doesn't come close to stopping them.
Right. I mean, I think China has already released a statement saying that these unilateral sanctions have no basis in international law. They don't go through the UN Security Council. So I imagine India is going to be doing something similar, is that, like you said, they just have to work around a new arrangement, settle the sales in their own currencies. Really what you're doing is you're forcing the creation of this alternative financial system, which is that China has largely taken the lead in with its SIP systems. And I heard over 145 countries now are able to just do direct payments in their own currencies. It's a big thing that they've been working on for the past 20 years. And now it's like, okay, well, here's the time to use it. So we just have to, it's just making that transition. And thanks to Trump, and the secondary sanctions, I imagine that transition is going to be accelerated.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's part of the same.
Russia, it's their region. India, China, and Russia, they're all in that area together. I mean, Russia and China have a huge border together. You think that you can just stop them trading, stop them, buying each other's buying oil from Russia? It's insane.
Right?
They can't do it, right? Or if they do, I mean, they'll just say it in name, but in reality, we know it's still flowing.
Right. And I think, there are just all kinds of arrangements that can be made, whether it's going to be pipelines or whatever. There are other ways so some of these things take years. Other things will just take weeks or months. But there are other ways to get the oil to them, I'm sure. And if clearly it is in the interest of India. India, again, is a poor country and it doesn't produce its own energy. It needs this oil, and it needs the cheapest oil that it can get. And the Indians understand that, and they'll find a way to make it happen.
Right. Well, I mean, like, and you saw in that video, Trump seems very confident that you will see what Russia's saying in 6 months, that we put the squeeze on them. What do you think is going to happen with this sanction? Is it just going to backfire, nothing come of it, just Russia continues doing what it's doing? Or will we see the big effect of it will be a more rapid decoupling from the dollar is really what it
well, I think that's a certainty. That's, again, every time that the U.S. does this, what they're doing is they're abusing their own, their domination of the world financial system to punish, well, not just enemies, but in this case, it's a supposed friend. They're punishing other countries. And that just, of course, forces all these countries to look at the alternatives, which are, as you pointed out, are now available. And so that's an inevitable consequence. Now, the thing is, like, if it is successful for any period of time, it will come back, it'll rebound and come back to hurt us and the Europeans, because it will raise energy prices, oil prices in particular, significantly. If you actually get a substantial share of that Russian oil off the market, there will be consequences. It's very simple. There is a law of supply and demand. And if you reduce the supply and the demand is constant, and there's no reason to believe that it's not going to be constant or growing. And especially in places like India, the Indian economy has actually grown quite a bit in the past few years. Their demand's going to grow, so they have, again, every incentive to find a new way of acquiring Russian oil. But in the meantime, of course, Europe is going to suffer, and the U.S. is going to suffer higher oil prices. I think it's inevitable. Now, so if in fact it does succeed for any length of time, now if it doesn't, like they figure out some sort of workarounds in the next couple of weeks, then there will just be a blip in that we've already seen in oil prices, and everything will be back to normal.
When this decoupling takes place, what does it mean for the U.S. just everyday consumers? How does it affect us? Because I feel like even though we're talking about these huge things, this trade war, these tariffs, these sanctions, there's talks about still seizing the Russian assets, which I think looks like it's going to happen. All these things are causing countries to look at the dollar differently and say maybe we shouldn't park our money here, we should get out of it. But it doesn't feel like anything significant has changed for me as an American using my dollars during here as opposed to during the Biden time. It's still prices, things are still expensive. Nothing is really shot up. Like what is
right.
If this decoupling is taking place, why aren't we seeing it? How should we see it, or when will we see it?
Well, I think the decoupling is taking place, but the again, there's always a tipping point, and we really haven't hit that. I mean, there is a point where the U.S. dollar will cease to be the world's reserve currency, or it'll suffer, let's say, a very significant demotion. I think that's inevitable, and when that happens, and it's actually already beginning to happen, what's happening is that it's becoming increasingly difficult for the U.S. government to borrow money. It's actually through borrowing money that we print money. That's quantitative easing. It's that we issue these bonds. It just created them out of thin air. And in the past, governments would buy them at basically 0%. So it was free money for us. And that's something that allowed us to get through these crises and to avoid the consequence of, the growing debt. But that has already changed. It's just that China and other countries are not buying up U.S. dollars the way they once did. And that means that, when we attempt quantitative easing, well, there aren't the buyers there. And so what do we have to do? We have to start to make the bonds more attractive. We have to raise the interest rates.
Don't we buy them ourselves as well, right? Isn't it we monetize our own debt that way? The Treasury buys. That's why the whole system's messed up.
Yeah, well, that's part of it. But again, you're going to have to, right? But you can only do so much of that. That's just
right. I know it can't be completely, but it's moving more in that direction.
Right, because that's just pure, money printing, and nobody's taking it off, for taking on the burden for us. It's all on us. And so, at some point, then you have we cease to be, let's say, really protected, cushioned from the effects of our own profligate spending. We have been for years, for decades, but because of the status of the U.S. dollar. But as that declines, then the ability to, again, cushion ourselves from that, the effects of excessive spending, that ability declines as well. And we will start to see, basically the Fed lose control. They're going to be caught between a hard place. Either they have to raise interest rates sharply, again, to get people to actually buy these bonds. But if they do that, then the effects of the debt, we're already paying, a huge amount. I think it's like 2/3 of our deficit. A deficit of 1.8 trillion is actually just is taking the form of payments towards the interest, interest payments on the debt. And then if you raise our interest rates are actually still at historically low levels. If we're forced to raise them higher, which will happen as the dollar continues to lose its status as a reserve currency, that will just go up. It'll start to explode, and we're going to be in real trouble. So that's at some point, the chickens will come home to roost. You see the process happening. It's not something in the distant future. It was something just theoretical, like 10 years ago, 20 years ago. Now it's something that you see the process beginning. It's like the ball starting to roll. It's starting to roll towards the cliff, and at some point it will go off the cliff.
Right. I guess in my mind, though, once the ball started to roll, I felt like it would pick up speed very quickly. And I'm kind of surprised that it hasn't, because usually I feel like when these things when you have something that's really just founded just purely on the faith of the U.S. Government, and there's nothing backing it, and it's just undermining itself, I felt like once these countries came to that realization, there would be a mad rush to get rid of your dollars and acquire some other type of assets, like gold, which is one of the reasons we're seeing gold go up very much.
Right.
But
Again, we are seeing signs of it, but it's right. I think again, like within our community, we're very, very much aware of it. A lot of other people and governments are not so much aware of it. They're still they have trouble accepting the new reality. I think it's there's a lot of inertia. There's a lot of a reluctance to accept the way the world has changed, because the world has been this way really ever since 1945. It's just like for all these different traders and, government officials, it's just, there was like one rule that was burned into their brains. It's like, when in doubt, put your trust or put your dollars in the U.S. And obviously some countries like China and, other countries, and not just, but also institutional investors are beginning to move away from that. We're seeing that change, and we see the price of gold going up and all that. It's part of a process that is going to be undermining this longstanding arrangement. But there's still a lot of inertia. There's institutional inertia, government inertia, and a reluctance to acknowledge the new reality. You'd be surprised. I think that's often true. Like I've talked, it's just like this is one of those. These bubbles are created. Certain people who are very, clear-sighted, have a clear understanding, say, hey, this is a bubble, it will pop. And they're right. But I've always seen how that bubble will go on for years longer than you think it will. But then it will pop. And this is like the bubble of all bubbles. And it may go on longer than, I'm not going to make any predictions because it's always so hard to predict it.
But you think there will be a pop? Like, we see trends, but you think there'll be a day basically when we turn on the news, like, boom, it's happened.
Yeah,
dollars in free fall. And
right,
so most people it'll hit them like just a ton of bricks, right? They won't even, if they're not paying close attention like we are, it'll just be like, oh.
I think it could, I think so. Because that's sort of the nature of financial collapses. Actually, financial collapses are particularly rapid. And everything could seem normal until one day, when all of a sudden it's like, whoops, wait a second, nobody's buying our bonds. We raise them 1%, still nobody's buying the bonds. And then panic sets in all around,
Right.
And who knows how far away that is. It could be in the very near future, but I'm just not going to make any predictions. It's
right. Okay. Yeah. Any day it could happen any day, really. So many things to think about. It's wild.
Right.
Well, I wanted to touch a little bit about what's going on the front line in Ukraine.
Yeah, I think we need to. Important things.
I'll let you just take it. I know that there's some
right. I guess I'll just we'll quickly look. Recently, the Ministry of Defense made an announcement that 10,500 soldiers, Ukrainian soldiers, had been encircled in two locations, Kupiansk and Provkovsk. And when you're talking about Provkovsk, it's also Minigrad. We're considering those two cities together. One is a suburb. Minigrad is a suburb of Pokrovsk. And that's major news. And I was struck just looking at the maps of this and thinking about how these battles have developed, how we are seeing, again, as we pointed out, one thing that's different from the past is that we see multiple cities or fortress towns actually becoming encircled and going down approximately at the same time. Whereas in the past, it was maybe one city at a time. It's just like up and down the front. There are multiple ones. So the two largest are Kupiansk isn't particularly large, but it's a very important one. And then Pokrovsk, we're talking about more than 100,000 if we include Minigrad in terms of 2022 population. So it's a major city. This will be the largest city, you know, again, considering those two together, since Mariupol, which had a pre-2022 population of 400,000, if I remember correctly. But that happened fairly early on, way back in 2022. So in the last 3 years, this would be the largest. So it's really quite significant. Now, what's happening too is that both of these places are falling in differently than cities we've seen over the last couple of years or 3 years. Just take Bakhmut as an example. You know, Bakhmut, what the Russians actually came at it pretty much, you know, directly from the east, as they usually do, and flanked it so that put it into a semicircle, but then just drove forward. So most of the fighting actually was just head on, you know, with pressure from the flanks, from the sides, just as this semicircle. And they drove all the way through. They never actually closed the circle. You know, whether maybe they couldn't, maybe that was intentional, but we've seen some pretty much the same thing with some, you know, important variations in one of these other cities have fallen over the last 2 or 3 years. But this time it's different. You know, like in the case of Pokrovsk, the Russians actually approached it like towards the end of the summer, came very close to it, the end of the summer last year. And they were coming right at Minigrad, you know, coming from the east. And it looked like, you know, we're going to see the same thing. But something different happened. They pretty much held the line steady at the east, and then they worked around the way to the south. And they ended up taking just all the territory to the south of Pokrovsk. And then more recently, they began to do the same in the north. So they just avoided Minigrad completely. And then when they entered Pokrovsk, they didn't enter it from the east, as you know they would have in the past. They actually entered it from the southwest. You know, that's where they first, and from the south in general. Now, I think clearly the Ukrainians were not prepared for that. My understanding is that they built up their fortifications, above all in Minigrad. You know, they thought this is the easternmost part. This is where the Russians are going to come in. And so they invested a lot in building up the fortifications. But the Russians went around, and they're now actually like coming at Minigrad in some ways from the west, as well as from the north and the south. And less so from the east. So this is a real change. And then we're seeing something similar in Kupiansk. You know, it was actually way back in 2023, the Russians advanced towards Kupiansk. It was during that, you know, the great summer offensive of 2023, the Ukrainian offensive, that was ultimately defeated and was ultimately proved disastrous for the Ukrainians. The one place where the Russians advanced was towards Kupiansk, and they got a lot of territory. They came close to it, you know, but then they slowed down and didn't do much. Nothing much happened there for a year. But then about a year ago, they began, instead of going directly at Kupiansk, they went north and they crossed the Oskol River. They made a bridgehead well to the north of it, and then expanded that bridgehead and started to come down from the north, and then came into Kupiansk from the north and the west again, rather than going directly out of the east. So now what you have is all of the of Kupiansk to the west of the Oskol River is under Russian control now. And the remaining part, which is on the east side, which I think is, again, where the Ukrainians thought the Russians were going to attack, and I think most of us expected them to attack, that's the part that's still under Ukrainian control. But what has happened is, okay, they have that part on the east side of the river, and then there's a large pocket, a very large pocket. We're talking about a lot of land just on the east side of the Oskol River. You know, the Kupiansk is up to the north, but it goes down, you know, dozens of kilometers down the river. And so that pocket has been there for a long time. And I kept on thinking, well, that's got to close. And I know other people like, Scott have calibrated, you know, say that this doesn't make any sense for the Ukrainians to hold this. You know, they're out here and they got the river behind them. They should withdraw behind the river, but they didn't. Now they're in real trouble. And that's what the Ministry of Defense is talking about, because the Russians have destroyed all the bridges. They're stuck in that pocket. They have a little bit of Kupiansk to the east, and then they have all this land, but they're surrounded and then they have a river that is very difficult to cross. They'll try to make some sort of temporary bridge, and it'll be destroyed in a day or two. So they're in real trouble. They're in real trouble there in Kupiansk and also in Pokrovsk. And we see in both of these, again, they're going on at the same time while other cities are being, and fortress towns like Seversk are being laid siege to. So I think you have to say we're seeing a real acceleration and real indications of Russian strength relative to Ukraine. Now, one thing is that I had been paying attention to is like how much land, I know that, again, that land is not the only way to measure success, but, territory is part of it. I was looking to how much the Russians had taken relative to last year. And through most of this year, they've been taking, more land on the average than they did last year, but they were still short of the peak that happened in October and November of last year. Now, the thing about that peak, that happened after all the fortress towns like Avdiivka and Ugledar. Ugledar is very small, but it was a real fortress on the top of a hill. When those fell, then the Russians moved rapidly, and there was really very limited urban fighting. They were moving through, places where there just was much in the way of any kind of fortifications. And that's when you get those really, large acquisitions of territory. And was something which we haven't seen the Russians do quite, they haven't reached that same peak until actually just last week. They actually, there was kind of the weekly report and it showed that they had seized more territory than they ever had last year, even in November. So that's telling you something. And I think it's very significant because much of the fighting is going on within these urban areas, places like Kupiansk. Konstantinovka is another one where they're fighting within the city. And, of course, most of all, Pokrovsk, a city that once had more than 100,000 inhabitants. That kind of fighting always goes quite a bit slowly. So it's kind of hard. You're comparing apples and oranges. Back in the fall of last year, there was mostly open country that the Russians were going through. This time they're going through this urban area. But even so, we see they're making these gains in these cities or in towns. But even so, they've actually seized more territory in the last week than they ever did last year. And I think that's partly because other things are going on at the same time. There's been rapid advances in places like, Zaporozhye and Dnipropetrovsk to the south, again, where they're actually an open country. Or as they approach Liman, another important town that they're going to lay siege to soon, they're actually coming at it pretty quickly. So it just tells you, look at it, no matter how you look at it, you look at the kind of towns they're taking or the amount of territory they're taking, they're going faster than they ever have before.
So how critical is the situation for Ukraine?
Well, it's very critical. It's a major blow. There's no question about it. And the thing is, the Russians won't take all of these places, but at once. It looks like some of them may fall very quickly, like Pokrovsk. Sometimes, in the case of Pokrovsk, it's basically very close to being physically encircled. I was looking at the map. You could see there's one road that maybe hasn't been cut off, but it's very, very close to territory held by the Russians. So it may just be unusable at this point. And in fact, it's certainly in what they call the gray zone, at least. And the Russians, who knows? Sometimes it's just like there are reports that they have taken the road. We just don't know for sure. If they have, then the forces the Ukrainian forces in Pokrovsk are entirely and physically encircled. And that would, again, that's a real disaster. What can they do? They talked about they've done what they can. They have sent their best guys there, their best units. And there's a talk about actually sending in GUR special forces. And GUR is military intelligence in Ukraine. But it's not even clear that they can get them in there. And if they can, I think it's clearly already too late. So these places are going to collapse. And eventually, like Seversk and Liman, these places are also going to fall. It may take a little bit longer, but maybe not a whole lot longer. Maybe by the end of the year, maybe the first, couple months of next year, but they will all fall. And when they do, then there's Konstantinovka, again, which is just to the east of Pokrovsk, and that's going to fall too. And that may last longer. It's a pretty good-sized town we're talking about, better than 60,000. But when Pokrovsk falls, then there's really, they'll be able to come up from the south. They're already going into it from the east and the north, and it will fall too. So when all these fall, this will happen over the next several months, maybe even faster. There will just be remaining two, major towns, Kramatorsk and Slavyansk. And those have they're probably I think their population total is something, it's over 100,000. I think that's what we're talking about. It may actually even be a little bit, maybe like 150,000, something like that, in 2022 terms. So, it's major, but they'll be coming at it from all directions, because these other towns that are followed, they're to the north or the east or the south, they're going to be coming at it, at those towns from all directions, and they're going to be in real trouble. Now, they're still, that's a major, we're talking about a lot of urban area. I don't know what they'll do. They may just make some sort of great last stand there, but it won't be able to hold. And then that'll be the end of Donetsk, the Donbass in general.
So do you think that these 10,500 troops that are encircled, Ukrainian troops that are encircled, are you expecting a mass surrender, or are they going to fight to the death? No?
Well, the Russians have offered, have asked them to surrender. Say they're giving them a chance to surrender now, and we haven't seen one. Now that may be for different reasons. It may be that they have resolved, all of them, to fight to the death. But like Putin himself said, that the Ukrainians make it difficult for people to surrender. That's, to put it euphemistically, that they'll shoot people in the back who attempt to go over to the Russian side and surrender. And I think there's quite a bit of truth to that. There are elements. I think, we have a mix like in Pokrovsk. My understanding is that we have these dedicated, probably, ultra-nationalist units, but then we also have those conscripts to support people that have been seized on the streets and really don't want to be there. And I'm sure, that the great majority, I would think, would want to surrender, but they just may not be able to.
Okay. Well, do you think then if these troops, either they surrender or they're all killed, are we getting to a place where that's the straw that breaks the camel's back? I mean, morale-wise, just being able for the West to spin somehow that things are still okay, that Ukraine's still in the fight. I mean, how close do you see this getting to a real collapse? I know you don't like using that word. It's something that people throw around all the time.
Yeah. But. Well, I think, I think there will be something akin to a collapse at some point, and we could be close to it. But I'll just say in the past that I've heard so much talk about it, and the Ukrainians have continued to surprise, I think, all of us by remaining in the fight, even though they clearly are losing, and they're losing at an increasingly rapid rate. They have remained in the fight. A lot of that has to do with drones. Again, it's just that you don't need a whole lot of men to operate a drone fleet or a drone swarm. But that drone swarm can make it very difficult for you to advance, and you got to spend time, trying to locate the operators and take them out. They can be well hidden, and underground. But at some point, they're going to break through all that, because the pressure from the Russian side is unrelenting, and I just don't know when. Again, as I've also pointed out, if they're going to make good on their promises to take the four oblasts, we can see how Donetsk is pretty much bound to fall within, I'll just be actually very conservative and say a year, a very, there is still Zaporozhye. Zaporozhye is a major city. It's up there. How much? What is 700,000? I think that's right. 700,000.
Okay.
We're talking about a major, major city, and they haven't ever taken a city that size. That's bigger than Mariupol. And then Kherson, the Kherson region is on the other side. What is still under Ukrainian control is on the other side of the Dnieper River. And again, we've heard reports, rumors that there's something going on. There may be a bridgehead, but the fact that we haven't heard much about it makes me think that whatever happened was pretty minor. I think there was some kind of crossing, but it may have been kind of more of a, surveillance and sabotage or, kind of operation. Scouting and sabotage. I forget exactly the term that you use. But they will have to cross that river, and that's a major undertaking. So even if they, to just make good on that promise, it's going to take some time. There's a lot ahead. And then if we're going to go on and take Odessa, there are several rivers that they would have to cross to get to Odessa if they're just going to head to the west. And Kharkov, there's talk maybe they'll take the Kharkov region. I think there's a real possibility. Of course, they are in Kharkov right now, and actually in several areas. They've crossed the border into Kharkov, but the city of Kharkov is the second largest in Ukraine, and it has a population of 1.4 million, or it did. Again, we're talking about very large. So there's a lot ahead of us, and so I'm. It may be that there really is at some point where the will to fight or just the ability to fight is just going to completely break down, and that these barriers won't be so large as they are now. But at the present time, I see, some significant barriers. So I think there will be a point where everything will accelerate, and things that seemed impossible, seem impossible now will actually not be so difficult. Again, it's just if this war attrition really achieves its objective, and I think eventually there's no question that it will at some point, and just the ability for the Ukrainian armed forces to resist is just broken. And then we'll see all those things happen. But it's hard to say when. It could be, it could be soon. We do see a real decline in the ability to resist. And, I was just describing what was happening in those two battles. And that, I think that's indicative of a real weakening. But when that actually leads to collapse is hard to say.
Yeah. Well, I hope those Ukrainian men do the right thing and surrender.
Yeah.
I was just thinking last night just how terrifying it must be if you're one of those guys that you're completely encircled, just sitting in some bunker or trench with a rifle while there's glide bombs coming in and doing massive damage, drones outside, the hypersonic missiles, and what am I doing with this little pea shooter? What am I going to do here? It's just
Well, again, I mean, it's crazy. It's very foolish on the part of the military leadership in Ukraine to keep them there. They should have been withdrawn probably a month ago, at least, months ago from both Kupiansk and from Pokrovsk. And it looks like in places like, for example, Seversk, again, the encirclement is close to being becoming complete, and they really should be withdrawing now, but they don't. This is what we've seen. This is Zelensky and Sersky. They just fight to the end, and they do put up this resistance, but by doing that, they actually just play into the hands of the Russians. The Ukrainian forces are retreated all the more quickly, and that day of the collapse will come all the sooner.
Right. Yeah, it's really sad that it seems like nobody in the West cares about how many Ukrainians die. They're okay with letting them all die.
Well, that's one of the things. You get all these brave statements from, Western leaders. Yeah, they're being brave. They're standing against the Russians, but they're not the ones that are doing the fighting. It's not even their children that are dying. Right, or even their own people. It's the Ukrainians, and Ukrainians. So many of them that don't want to even be there, that haven't volunteered, but that have been grabbed and forcibly conscripted. So it's sickening, actually. It's all this brave Churchillian posturing, but it's cowardly in the end. It means that they really have a lot of blood on their hands.
Yeah. This Ukraine war, it just, this glimpse, it's more than a glimpse now. This view of a 21st century war, it's terrifying. It's scary, but I feel like the West doesn't seem to recognize it, how scary, a true war between NATO and Russia would be with these drones, these hypersonic missiles, these glide bombs, the Oreshnik, It's terrifying. I mean, even what we saw, just also the exchange like between Israel and Iran, seeing what Iran was able to do just with these hypersonic missiles. Like we've never seen this before on television. And I feel like Americans, people in the West, we're just so used to watching superhero movies that it's just like, it's kind of like that for us. You know, we don't realize like, hey man, this is terrifying. This is scary stuff. Yeah, just because you're not there, but we need to learn how to have some empathy for.
Right. Well, again, if you're just looking at mainstream media, you don't really understand what's going on. Like, for example, in the case of the 12-day war, very little of that footage actually made it into the mainstream. Some of it did. But it was like us who go to alternative media saw a lot more, and we understood what was happening. A lot of them just don't. And the Israeli line is that, this is just very minor, occasional stray missile, and there's nothing, the Iranians are just being thoroughly thrashed by us. And then in the case of like Russia, I've just yesterday I was looking at mainstream reports on the recent missile attacks. And it was basically saying, they hit a few residential towers. So it was like these, rather than actually reporting on these overwhelming strikes that are just taking out entire factories and, and energy infrastructure. They're talking about the occasional drone that probably was diverted from its course, or maybe it wasn't even a drone strike. It was, it was an air defense missile or whatever that actually hit a residential tower. Again, when you look at the scale of these attacks, the number of civilian casualties are extremely, extremely low. But the Western media will just let you think that it's just the Russians are pathetic and evil. They won't talk about the hundreds, of missiles and drones that got through and did the real extensive damage to the military infrastructure of Ukraine. They'll talk about the two instances where residential towers hit. And so, you'd have to be forgiven if you were somebody just looking at this stuff, watching CNN or something, to think like, the Russians are pathetic. They got 2 drones to hit some residential towers. I mean, there's just a real distortion of the reality. So there are a lot of people who still live in that kind of that fun house, with the fun house mirrors.
Yeah. Well, we got to wake up eventually. I think that there's too many things happening now on so many fronts for the U.S. empire to hold out long. Maybe I'm wrong, but I have a feeling. It's scary just everywhere around the world. I just have a feeling though that Trump might be our last president, and may not be, and the U.S. as we know it, by the next election cycle. I don't know how this country is going to survive all this nonsense, and at least the empire. And when the empire collapses, I don't know what that means domestically. I don't think we can just go back to being a republic. There might be some. Yeah. Anyways, we won't go down there. I think we can end it there.
Sure.
All right. Thanks a lot for all the updates, Dad.
Okay.
Okay. Have a good rest of your day.
You too.
I'll talk to you soon. Okay.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.